So, hi everyone. With me today, I have again Josef Schiefer, who is head of product for OZGAR AI. OZGAR is a legacy code intelligence platform, and I'm super happy to have Josef again for the talk. Welcome,
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
Josef. Since our last conversation, I've been thinking about something you said last time in a previous episode. OZGAR doesn't rewrite code; it just understands it. But every major tech company like Microsoft, Google, Amazon is selling kind of the opposite story, right? AI will rewrite your legacy systems and you're just going against the $1 trillion narrative. Let's start there. Why are they wrong?
Well, I would say they're not wrong. There are just different ways you can approach the problem, right? With Oscar AI, we try to approach the problem in a more traditional way, I would say. Give you an example. A lot of these solutions, AI solutions, like Copilot-like solutions, very often what you do is you phrase your problem and it directly jumps to code to a solution. There are famous directions now like vibe programming that do that well for you. But what is the biggest problem when you do that? It's is that the human understands what the AI is actually doing. And this is where Oscar AI comes in. With Oscar AI, we approach this problem a bit differently. We not just make this a side product, what happens in between and the steps, for example, what a copilot is executing. We make this an intermediate deliverable that is visible to the user so that you have a full understanding and can do this for reviews and have a discussions with your colleagues before we jump to the implementation. And by the way, this is the traditional way of how we do our traditional best practice in software engineering. Right? What do you do typically in the traditional world? Well, you write up your problem, you review it with the colleagues, right? You write the specification or design doc, review with the colleagues, and then you start implementing it. I think with the co-pilots, we think right now a lot of solutions try to skip that. And I believe when you skip it, you have a problem that human understands what the AI is actually doing. The more complex the problem, the more you run into that issue.
Absolutely.
I hope that makes sense. And Oscar is really focusing on this, making the solution understandable, also creating this artifact for potential changes. You not jump right away into code. You create actually these intermediate artifacts also, whether these are documents or diagrams, so that you have a full understanding of the issue and the implications when you make a software change. And that we use as foundation to generate the code later.
And this is where I think the very interesting design philosophy of Oscar comes to play, because the tagline, "We're extending the life of legacy apps," some might consider controversial in the AI code analytics space. The prevailing wisdom is migrate it, modernize it, just move it, lift and shift it to the cloud, adapt it. But you're saying, no, let's make these systems last longer and extend their life with Oscar AI. Is there something fundamentally misunderstood about when to decommission a legacy system and when to utilize Oscar for keeping it alive?
Well, good question. I think for both cases, there are good reasons to do it, especially when you migrate off the legacy system. This is always typically, that means more effort and higher risks. And with that said, extending the lifetime of a system very often is more low risk. And there is, that's why can be attractive. It depends always on the situation. There are good reasons to also do migrations to get additional features that the legacy system doesn't have, or it's hard to implement, or having not the engineers anymore that can maintain the system. It's always, it depends on the customer situation, but it's extending the lifetime and having a good transparency what the application is doing and making it very maintainable is a very low risk option.
Right. And this is where you differentiate yourself from kind of the generic code analyzers. And thinking about this, like, let's consider for a moment, that object detection sounds simple, I think, until you think about it. Like, there's code that runs once per year, for example, for tax reasons. There's conditional branches that trigger only during certain situations. Deprecated endpoints that one legacy client still hits. How do we avoid deleting the code that's keeping the business alive? And what's the Oscar approach to this problem?
Yeah, well, let me explain why we're actually running into that. Why is it good to delete dead objects in general? And what's the value of it? So first of all, it's valuable information for the user to understand what is used and what not used. But there are other reasons also to look into dead objects. Like we realized that, for example, for AS5 application, there are a lot of dead objects, and the dead objects don't need to be processed in by OZGAR by LLMs when we prepare the data for the analytical processing. So it saves actually also a lot of costs, and it also helps to reduce the latency or reduce the time it takes to ingest the data. So there are several reasons why data object elimination and discovery makes sense or is of value. Now, also one reason I forgot to mention, and there is data objects are typical noise in the data, right? So when OSCAR is a RAG solution, retrieval augmented generation solution, and when we have a lot of noise in the data, actually the chatbots don't work so well, or there is less accuracy suffering. So it helps actually also with the accuracy of the answers and with the accuracy of the generated documentation at the end of the day.
Right. So here's an example scenario. Let me ask you this. Financial services company or a bank has, I don't know, 35 years of accumulated legacy code. They think 30% of the code is dead. You analyze it with Oscar and you find out that 8% is truly dead and 50% is toxic, actively making the systems worse. What's the approach there? What do you tell them? How do you prove it without breaking production?
Yeah, so the way we do the dead object detection is that we look at the programs whether they have been used for a certain period of time. So let's say a program that hasn't been used for more than a year. Then we have a second criteria is that we check whether the program was ever compiled. So when there is just a source code that never got compiled, where there is no compiled version in the system, so that's an indicator that it's not used. And last but not
Right.
least, we have information in the AS400 system timestamps when the program was executed. So this is something. So there are different system data that we look at, so that to really have a good indication whether source is or a program is in use or not. The data object detection works for sources, works for programs, works for tables, works for views, and so on, for different objects. The way we also determining is when there is an object that needs another object, like a program needs a table, let's say the program is dead or not used, and the table is only used by that program, then we can determine the table is also not used, right? Or can be also, is essentially also dead. So we also looking into the dependencies between programs and programs to sources and dependencies to tables and views. So we looking at these dependencies to determine whether something is used or not. OSCAR, we have that information in something called the knowledge graph, where we have all these dependencies stored very efficiently. And it is fairly simple for us to figure out, when or following up on these usage chains, whether something is in use or not.
That's a great segue into something I wanted to ask you about in the way that you use large language models to solve for these challenges. Now, every major AI vendor right now is kind of in a game of chicken with inference costs, right? So OpenAI is subsidizing usage, Anthropic is racing to efficiency, and so on. But everyone is bleeding money essentially and Oscar is a startup. Walk me through one specific architectural decision, maybe the way you do the knowledge graphs or some other aspect that you made that makes Oscar economically viable at scale.
Yeah, we have done a lot of investment in making OSCAR more efficient and cost effective, essentially. And the one way to do that is to actually look into where is the most money spent when you do the LLM processing. Actually, what we realize is a lot of the LLM processing, when we started with Oscar, we can do also without LLM. That's the biggest and easiest cost saver. There is some additional efforts to do that, but we realized there are some tasks that LLM have been done in the past within Oscar that actually, when we do it manually, are way more accurate and faster. So there is not just the benefit of saving costs, it's even faster and more efficient. Give you an example. So for example, recently we made an improvement to discover which tables are used by a program. You can ask an LLM for that. You can just simply feed the code and say which tables is that code using. Our Oscar very early version did that. Or you can parse the code and figure out then, in the code, understand the code and figure out the statements that are within the code that have lines that use tables. And we measured that actually our own implementation is much more accurate and faster and efficient than the LLM does. So there are simple, sometimes quite simple ways to get more cost efficient. But we try to use LLMs really only when we have to. We play also a lot with the types of models that we use for the different types of programming, types of processing. So we not use one model that throw a lot of reasoning at every task. So we try to really minimize or use the model for the best, that does the best job. So we use a lot of mini models, for example, for that reason, that are rather fast in execution, but do less reasoning and they are much cheaper. So there are a lot of areas where you can tweak and make the processing much more efficient, cost efficient, and also efficient in terms of time it takes to do data ingestion and to do the processing of chatbot requests.
Yeah,
It's an ongoing story. It will never end. I believe this is something we continuously invest, and over time, where the platform grows with more capabilities and the platform gets more and more efficient over time.
and also the importance of actually bringing good engineering and just good algorithmic thinking into the process. I mean, there's people who are literally generating random numbers with LLMs now, which I was arguing with someone recently and looked and said, actually, it's 1 millionth time less efficient than doing it with the random function. So there's certainly a lot to that that you guys are bringing in terms of efficiency. Well, the other question that I had is, I mean, you started with IBM I, right? Which is one of the most arcane, complex systems on earth, right? Now you're expanding into COBOL mainframes, Java, maybe .NET. I'm curious about how do you tackle accuracy degradation as you add languages and platforms? How do you prevent Oscar from becoming works pretty well on any example kind of a tool and keep it focused?
Yeah, accuracy is always a good topic with LLMs, right? So we have multiple attempts to get accuracy up in Oscar, and we're still working on it. And I can give you a bit some insights on what we did over time. One challenge that we see, for example, with Oscar is LMs are not good when you have long lists and when you do calculations and say, give me a list of all display files from the system, and there are 3,000 files. It will just give you maybe a few back and give you back. And if you ask for the count, it is usually always the wrong count. So how do you solve that problem, right? And in Oscar, we have been introducing a concept called power table, where any kind of list is not generated by the LLM itself. The LLM creates a query for the backend to our backend indices and the backend database. And we run the query, and the query delivers the result and is put back into the response. So that makes the result accurate. The challenge doing that is just shifting from creating a list to generating the right query to the backend. So there's still a challenge to do that and make this really work well. But this is what we have done in Oscar to ensure accuracy. It's just one example where we improve accuracy. Essentially what we did do here is that for delivering the list, we not use the LLM. Again, we build our own implementation and we delegate it to a query. It essentially it doesn't have to be a query. It could be also something else. It could be an API or it could be, but as soon as you give the problem to an LLM, you don't get accurate answers anymore. So this is why we only use the LLM where the LLM is good at, and where it has weaknesses, we replace it with our own implementation.
It's a great differentiator to any of the standard platforms. If you think about the standard platforms, now GitHub Copilot has 1.8 million paying users. It writes code. OZGAR doesn't write code, or probably not yet. Maybe we'll talk about that. And some would say you're bringing a knife to a gunfight. Make the case for why understanding legacy system beats generation migration, and why would developers and their managers be willing to pay for both?
Well, first of all, it doesn't beat generation. With Oscar, we really believe that it is the foundation for anything else you do with your code. You have to really deeply understand it. If you not deeply understand it, anything you do as a next step is not going to work well. That's why we build this strong foundation. And the strong foundation can be used, and not just for code generation, it can be used for troubleshooting your application. It can be used maybe to do code reviews. It can be used for writing specifications or extensions. So it can be used for different things. But it's the foundation in the software development, and going further in the software development lifecycle is the deep understanding of the application. Without that, you will have always poor quality in later stages.
So, Josef, you worked at Snowflake. You work on one of their key products. Snowflake succeeded by telling data teams, stop managing infrastructure, just query data. You telling legacy teams, stop fearing your code base, just ask it questions and understand it. Is this a similar playbook? And if Snowflake is now worth, I don't know, 50 billion, what's the total addressable market for code intelligence? Because you put Oscar as code intelligence.
That's a good question. There is a lot. I believe code intelligence is just a word to do analytics with code. Right? It's just a fancy word to express that. And anything you can apply the same concept to other areas too. Then we would call it business intelligence, or I don't know, robotics intelligence, whatever it is. So this is not this is just one area that we are focusing on, and we're trying to get good at. But it strongly believe that everything you do with the AI, you have a deeper understanding of the problem and what, for example, when you deal with applications, it's about what the application is doing. It sets the foundation to do something with that application, whether it's human or AI. The AI also works much better if it has a good understanding what the application is doing. When the AI has to read everything from the source code and then to generate the next step, there's a lot of reasoning necessary. However, when there's already some abstraction done, and there is, for example, like a description of the functions, and there is some knowledge and facts generated from the source code, the AI also works better to do automation, to generate code, to do troubleshooting, whatever the task is. So it works really well for humans and AI, right? So and sets the foundation for both.
Right. Now let's get a bit more uncomfortable with next two questions, because I really want to challenge you and challenge us how we think about those things in terms of market. AWS had Code Group. Google has Cloud Code. Microsoft is, building AI into Visual Studio. So, those things are free or close to free for existing customers. With Oscar, it's essentially a startup charging enterprise prices for analyzing IBM systems and beyond. Like, why should a top Fortune 500 CTO just not wait for AWS to bolt this onto their existing platform?
It all boils down how well it works, right? Does it work, right? How well does the AI work? For this problem I just told you before about that we try to solve with power tables. Does a Microsoft or AWS have such a solution? Or do they, when you ask how many display files are there in your application, and you get the answer, there are 25, and there are 500 in the application. So I think it boils down in terms of quality and accuracy, how well that solution will work. This is, I think, where OZGAR, we invested a lot of time, to make the AI work well. And this often means that we work around LLMs and add additions and extensions where we do our own implementation to get accurate answers or to improve efficiency. This is actually our knowledge that we add to the table, and where we believe we might have an edge over an AWS or.
I think that's an interesting vision. Gartner, Forrester, the analyst firms have the categories of application modernization, I believe legacy transformation. But what you're claiming here with Oscar and the vision that you have is basically a new category, enterprise call intelligence, which is a great, I think, field to capture, right?
There are, the market is big. There are similarities in a lot of solutions out there. Right now, in OZGAR, we focus a lot of the intelligence and the analysis of the code itself, not so much on what you do with it and like code generation. I think this is a bit the difference also, as you mentioned earlier, that big guys, they do more code refactoring and it's integrated in the IDE because of that. And our solution is not part of the IDE. But at some point, we will have also our IDE plugins and do the refactoring, but we will have a much more solid, accurate foundation to do the refactoring. This is coming. This is probably coming next year where we start doing that. We can expect that the quality of the code that we generate, or the quality of output, whether it's code or scripts or anything you want to generate with large language models, that we have a very solid data foundation that is different than you would just look into the code itself, and that is the prime information only.
I'm well familiar with the challenge in other projects that we do in a similar fashion, where this, I think, this context engineering of such artifacts will become more complex and more important. At some point, what you're referring to as building out the knowledge base and treating it more as a warehouse containing all the artifacts.
Exactly.
This
So we
kind of
use this data warehouse approach and knowledge base approach in preparing knowledge and facts before we do actually the processing, like chatbot queries and documentation generation and so on. I think this is fundamentally different than generating just an index on the fly like a Copilot does. We look at data sources, a lot more data sources, like in data warehousing. You would look in various data sources and bring them together and stitch them together. That's what we do. So we have this knowledge graph, for example, where we have maybe an RPG application in the back end and a Java application in the front end, and then in the knowledge graph, we can stitch these applications together so we can know how a Java front-end application calls an RPG backend application. So this is something we can do because of having this knowledge base and this data warehouse approach. And you can build out this knowledge and enrich this knowledge over time more and more. And so this is not just a one-time indexing on the fly operation, like Copilot would do that. For us, this is the knowledge is there's a lot of processing that goes into the preparation of that knowledge. There are a lot of facts generated on the way. It's very useful to get more accurate answers and more high quality answers.
Can you give me a few examples of where using Oscar would, let's say, prevent a disaster, where it's not just we improve productivity by 10% of our legacy maintenance, but I know a situation where you're either about to do a wrong change or catastrophic change from production, and Oscar is catching it, or whether you use Oscar to prevent a disaster that can be avoided.
Yeah, so there's many different ways to answer the question. The standard use case, Oscar, you may laugh now, is that companies come to us and say, well, use this legacy application, and there has been an engineer that has been working on this for many years, and this engineer is now leaving us because he wants to retire, and we don't know what to do next. We don't understand. The knowledge is kind of gone with that when the engineer is leaving. And that is especially for programming languages that are not used much anymore nowadays, like RPG and COBOL and so on. There is this situation that companies lose that knowledge. And this is what OZGAR does. It gives you that knowledge in the knowledge base and maintains that knowledge and make this knowledge accessible in an understandable way also to new users, to other users. And this knowledge is not lost. So this is also one scenario that is very common. Another use case that OZGAR is I believe very, very strong is in doing dependency analysis, right? So you say, well, I want to make this change. What side effects or where's, for example, when I add a field to a table, so what changes do I have to do? Which code do I have to touch? What is the complexity of that change? OZGAR will give you a solid answer, listing out all the objects that use, for example, a certain table, can generate you also the code for such a code change. But it gives you, I think the main insight is to understand the dependencies and the implications of a code change and give you confidence of making the change in a way that you can minimize the risk.
Thinking about confidence, think of another use case. Think M&A due diligence. A private equity firm is assessing whether they should buy a company with a 30-year-old system landscape, and they have 50 days to assess technical risk. How does OZGAR compress that timeline? That would normally take someone not 2 months, but like 6 months to break it into something more actionable within weeks.
Yeah, I mean, technical due diligence, before we talked about data objects, right? This is also an indicator when there's a lot of data objects, usually that means also it's legacy code and code that is not used and it's just noise. OZGAR can give you information inside what the application is actually doing. There gives you a functional overview, you can ask questions where it's very complex code or where there are certain types of coding problems. Maybe there is certain patterns people use for exception handling that is rather dangerous, or maybe there are security problems. OZGAR will find you these places in the code. So essentially, when you do a due diligence, OZGAR will help you to navigate very quickly through the internals of the application and find you the places that you are most interested in. This is in general, especially when you use the chatbot for experts. Experts usually know a lot about the application, but what OZGAR does, it makes you faster pinpointing or finding certain things very quickly. And so this is what the value add is then when an OZGAR comes in, where before you needed several hours or several days to figure out certain information. OZGAR, you ask the question directly and it gives you the information straight in your output.
I think that's a real use case of what you think the definition of an AI agent is, right? We know what AI agents are, but in this case, you're really using it as a human interacting with OZGAR to get that information as if you're talking to a real person, right? It's just that they retired
Absolutely.
and that their implicit knowledge is basically analyzed and fed back to you answering questions, right?
Yeah, and
There's
usually
certainly some.
sorry that I just extend you a bit my answer. There is very often it's a conversation with the AI to get the answer. It's not just one answer, right? So usually you ask a question, and then the OZGAR gives you an answer, and then you say things like, I want to have more of that, or can you give me the details on something that you saw in the response? So you keep on, navigating through your inputs. These are all clues usually, so that you get the information that really solves your problem.
But
But
you
the
also
clues,
incorporated
yeah,
you also incorporated this learning feedback. which I think is also quite interesting because it's not just interacting with the AI. If you see that Oscar is didn't get something right, you can point out why, and this would be fed back into the system.
Yes, yes. So this is something we also have been seeing, that there is sometimes tribal knowledge in people's heads that are just not available in code or written down form. And this is where in Oscar, when you ask a question, for example, and you don't get a good answer, there is always an option revise, and then you can correct it, right? And this is especially, we have a user role or reviser, where typically this is an expert user, where you can overwrite an answer and correct it. And next time people would ask the question, these overrides will always kick in and will correct the answers. So essentially, the overrides are facts that we store in a knowledge base that are used for any kind of chatbot answer or for any kind of documentation generation.
Yeah, this makes it a living system, and provides a difference and a differentiator to some of these more one-sided
Yeah, so
platforms.
there's a human loop that we support with supporting revisions, where human can at any time add additional knowledge to any kind of output the system generates. This information, I try to consider it always as an override what the AI would be doing. And
Right.
these overrides are also knowledge again, now facts. They're treated the same way as other facts, and that makes over time the system smarter and smarter and more accurate.
And more accurate. Precisely. And again, nothing against Silicon Valley, obviously, but just as a difference, some of these regulated industries, and Oscar, you guys work with it. We, specific group, do too. Banking, healthcare, insurance. I mean, we don't just move fast and break things in these industries. There's like audit trails, explainability, compliance, et cetera, et cetera. You mentioned earlier also the on-premise deployment. Are you winning such customers? Do you think this is a differentiator for Oscar because you're not a black box cloud SaaS tool? Where do you see this on-premise close to the legacy systems and using on-premise LLMs for Oscar play in the future?
Yeah, good question. So there is on-premise installation. The reason why we do that is because code is a very sensitive artifact in terms of what it really makes when it would be exposed to the public. There would be a lot of vulnerability for the company, and there's these cyber attacks and the opportunity. The more the outside knows on how an application works internally, it creates security risks. So that's why most or pretty all customers don't want to really expose their source code at all to the public, right? So this, and there is one solution is just to have it on premise, and there is no internet access at all to the public, and when there is something exposed to the public, this goes through firewalls and it's very locked down. When we do code analysis with Oscar need to have access to the source code. And in an AS400 system, you actually need to access the AS400 system directly to get the source code. So there is no Git repository. Nowadays, there are also some companies that do Git repositories, but in AS400 world, typically you go directly to the AS400 system to get the information. And that's why there's always the preferred solution to have Oscar run close to the source system, so that there is nothing leaking going through different networks or going to the internet. Keeping a source system and Oscar together in the same network and having it locked down is usually the most secure solution. And so that is one reason why we do a lot of on-premise installations, especially in AS4 world. This will change a bit more when we support Java as a platform and as a programming language, where it's more common to have Git repositories and so on. But there are certain types of solutions and applications, especially legacy applications where on-premise installation is essentially the only viable security option. Right? Or the only option that customers would agree with. So cloud solutions and so on is very often not enough.
Right. But since you mentioned Java, so you're going from IBM I to COBOL to Java to .NET. And here's what I'm wondering. If Java and .NET are already, these systems are drowning in analysis tools like SonarQube, etc. What can Oscar show me about my Java system that IntelliJ or Eclipse with 50 plugins can't?
Yeah, well, Oscar, give you an example. Oscar, I would give you a nice functional overview what the application is doing. Would SonarQube do that? In SonarQube, you see the modules and you see the technical artifacts, but you never see the actual implemented processes or having a functional overview or having a nice overview of the data model. So this is what Oscar gives you, right? It gives you that. It doesn't just look at the technical artifacts. It really tries to focus on how the user wants to see it. Then the user typically would like to look at it as a process. I would like to see it as functional areas and where I can dive into it. And Oscar represents that in a way that is user friendly. That's why we have our own visualizations that support that. The functional areas, we have honeycombs, just as an example. For data model, people would like to see ER diagrams. That's why we have it. We have ER diagrams. So we really try to be very user centric and user focused. The way we show the information and the way a user would navigate then through the application.
And if you may allow, it's Oscar is, you guys go on a higher level on this data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, right? So it's not just showing statistics and some code artifacts, but kind of trying to get meaning and extracting this functional semantic layer out of that application is really a very interesting approach that I also don't think that these code analysis tools will just bolt on top pretty quickly because it's a completely different philosophy, and it's interesting to see how we go there. But last time we talked, we discussed that this category in general didn't exist. Now what we've talked earlier with you and with your colleagues is that you're seeing a lot of curiosity and adoption interest. What's the inflection point for Oscar, and when is enterprise code intelligence go from like an idea that is going more mainstream or a category that more people explicitly look for, do you think?
I think the mainstream will come when people start building their own solutions on top of it. Right. So when think about, you have a code base somewhere and it may be in GitHub or it may be in your AS400 application, and then you have an API and you can directly ask questions. What is the API doing, or what are the endpoints of that API, or how is this API configured, or how is the security of this application configured? You have an API that an Oscar API where you can ask these questions. And I believe Oscar, this becomes really mainstream when companies start building on top of Oscar and use this really as a platform, as a foundation for their own intelligence. And maybe it is for code reviews, maybe it is for refactoring, maybe it is for troubleshooting, maybe it is for business analysts to have a nice portal. So the companies and startups will start innovating using that information for different purposes, or leeching that information together with some other information and generate value out of it. I think this is where it becomes mainstream when this is happening.
Yeah. Final question, and I want you to be bold with this. Like 5 years from now, does Oscar get acquired by one of the top clouds or a major AI company, or is your vision to become the platform that everyone builds on top of or integrates with? And just what does winning for Oscar actually look like 3 or 5 years from now?
I'm not thinking about who could buy us. I'm thinking of how we generate value and enlighten our users and customers. This is what I really care about and my team really cares about. How to make Oscar really useful for our users and help with their pain when they don't understand the application, and just really nailing their problem. I think this Oscar, we architected as a platform. I think there is a lot of, with the foundation that we built, there will be a lot of creative ideas coming from other people and also from our customers, where some of these features we will build, and some of these features our customers will build, and some of these features probably startups or other companies will build. So this is what I am looking forward to really see users that are really happy with and that really nail a problem, and seeing delighted users and customers that really enjoy working with the platform.
Amazing. I think people should check out Osgar AI and see the power of something like Osgar for your legacy systems. We're very much looking forward to seeing your roadmap develop, and as you alluded to. And yeah, thanks so much for this discussion. Looking forward to speaking with you again.
Absolutely. Really enjoyed the talk and happy to have another session.
Cheers.